Okay, class, so in this video, I'm going to go over how to find domain and range on a graph. And this specifically is a piecewise defined function, the same one with the same sub-functions we used in the previous video. So in the previous video, we graphed this. Now that we have it graphed, let's determine our domain and range. Remember, domain is, if I'm looking at my graph, I'm going to my x-axis and saying, do I have a value there? Okay. Or starting on my x-axis and saying, will I see, let's say if I go to x equals positive 10, right? X, all of this whole line here would be the same value of x equals 10, x equals 9, x equals 8, and so forth. So if I were to go towards negative infinity, remember the best way to do it is going from least to greatest. So just like we read from left to right, and my values on my x to the left would be negative. So if I were to somehow see somewhere near negative infinity, would I have a value there? Would I have a value there? Of course, you would hit this green one. This one stops here, but this green one goes on forever to the left, forever. So I will see, if I went down like this, I would run into this green line here. So that tells me that I will have a value for my domain, or my domain starts at negative infinity. Negative infinity. So let's write that. And we're going to write this domain. We're going to write our domain and range in interval notation, which I've wrote here. So infinity signs have a parentheses because I can't actually land on that value. So starting from negative infinity, because we said if we could get somewhere near there and looked on that line, I would run into this green one, okay, and which is part of this piecewise function, comma, and then I'm going to ask myself, when do I stop seeing a graph? I did this on purpose here because this could be a little confusing. Once we get to x equals negative 1, negative 2, negative 3, negative 4. So remember, when we're looking at our domain, I'm asking myself, do I see any graph plotted on this line? And if I'm looking up here, I don't see anything. There's nothing up here. But as soon as I go down on x equals negative 4, I see an open dot, which also tells me there's no value there. It gets really close, but never actually lands there. So I can't count this green one. I wouldn't be able to see the green line at x equals negative 4. So I would just continue. But then if I continue down x equals negative 4, I see a closed dot there, and that is a value. It's actually on negative 4. So where this one ends, it immediately jumps here and then continues. Okay, so although it looks like there's a break here, like there I will see no values here, you do end up seeing a value down here. Okay, so I have to include negative 4. I can't just stop at negative 4. So starting from negative infinity, at negative 4 there's like a slight hiccup there, but you're like, oh no, wait, there is a graph, a point there. So I include it, and it continues, it continues, it continues, it continues. But then I get here. There's a break in here where this graph ends. There's no other graph between this one, the purple one, and the red one. Okay, so I want to know where this break happens. So if I look here, I go down to, since we're looking at our domain, I go down to my x-axis and I count. It's to the right, so it's positive 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So at x equals 5, there's a closed dot, which means it ends there, and it ends on that actual value. So I'm gonna write a 5. Okay, it's a closed dot. For closed dot, we use square parentheses or a bracket. Okay, then I'm gonna continue because I still have this red graph here. So there's no graph here, no graph here. At 6, where this open dot is at, there's still no graph there. There's still no graph. But as soon as I go just a bit to the right, then I start seeing this red line. So I want to know what x value is this one, right? So here at the open dot, I go straight down to my x, and that is x equals 6. So I'm going to write 6. It's an open dot, so I use a parentheses. And then I ask myself, where does it end? Well, it never really ends. It goes up and to the right forever. Okay, so if I were to go to the right to positive infinity, I would still see this graph. So I had to include positive infinity. Positive infinity cannot actually be landed on, so we use a parentheses. Now, between these, we write a U. That U means union, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Union is just saying, hey, from negative infinity to 5, I have values on my x. So if I were to go on any line, on any point here on this x-axis, I will find a graph, I will find a graph, I will find a graph, I will find a graph. Until I get here, I don't find a graph. Okay, so from negative infinity to 5, there's a domain there. Then it jumps and it starts at 6 or close to 6, and then continues to positive infinity. Now, if I want to unite them and say, hey, both of those are included in my domain, I write a U. So a U is written when there's a break in the graph like that. Now for my range, the same thing, only that now I'm going to my y, because range is my y. So if I start from negative infinity, I have none of these graphs point down forever. None of them. So I wouldn't start seeing a graph until this purple dot here, or for this graph. So as soon as I start rising from negative infinity, I won't see a graph. Look, no point, and none of these point down. So I wouldn't run into any of these sub functions until here. Here's a closed dot, there's an actual value, and I want to know at what y value we find that at. And that would be at -1, -2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So this would be -7. So I'm going to write that value down. So I start seeing values at -7. Now, I made a mistake here. It's not a parentheses. Instead, it is a bracket. Bracket because it's a closed dot. I continue asking myself, okay, going to the x-axis, to the y-axis. Oh yeah, values, there's a graph there. Oh, here, the graph, there's a green graph and a purple. Continue, yes, graph, I hit the purple. But then I get here at y equals +2, that's where my purple graph ends. Now, the red one doesn't continue until y equals 3. So there's a break in here. For just between 1 unit, there's no graph, no value for y. So at this purple dot is where my break happens, and that's going to be at +2. So I'm going to write that +2 here. And it's a closed dot, so it's going to have a bracket. Okay, so I saw graphs from here to here. There's no graph here, but then I start seeing a graph here or really close to it. That's where my open dot is at y equals 3. And then it continues on forever, going up and to the right. So that would be infinity. Now I start seeing it at y equals 3, so I'm gonna write 3, and I symbolized it with parentheses because it gets really close to 3, but never on it. And we use parentheses for open dots. To positive infinity. So if I were to choose a point way up there, I would run into this red one, this red graph. So essentially, for recap, domain, I'm going to my x-axis to see, and for range, I'm going to my y-axis.